Out past the last gas on winter roads, Alaska keeps its own archive. Hunters, troopers, climbers, and bush pilots leave cameras rolling because batteries die fast, and memory lies. Some tapes surface years later, pulled from thawed snow machines, sealed in Ziplocs inside ranger boxes, or mailed without a return address. Tonight on Fear Knocks, we review 10 recovered recordings no one has fully explained. A VHS sunk in glacial melt. A high-8 cassette from a locked tunnel. Dashcam pulled off a truck swallowed by whiteout. These clips bring wind, distance, and the kind of silence you can hear. If you watch, listen for what shouldn't be there. Footsteps where no one stands. Names said under breath. Lights. My name is Dr. Elias Vance, and I've been an aquatic acoustician for nearly 18 years. My work primarily involves environmental monitoring, often for government agencies or conservation groups. I specialize in passive acoustic monitoring, which means I listen to underwater soundscapes to track everything from whale migrations to the health of coral reefs. More recently, that's included salmon populations in rivers like the Kenai, here in Alaska. We were testing a new, surprisingly inexpensive hydrophone system for its viability in large-scale, long-term salmon counts. The idea was to deploy dozens of these units, creating a sonic grid to map fish movements without the cost of traditional sonar. It was late June, just past 2 in the morning. The Alaskan summer meant perpetual twilight, a soft gray glow that still felt like deep night. The air was cool, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and damp earth. I was huddled in our mobile lab, a converted Sprinter van parked on a gravel turnout, overlooking a particularly wide bend of the Kenai. My colleague, Lena, was asleep in the bunk behind me. Our primary unit, a prototype called the River 3000, was tethered to a weighted line, submerged about 10 feet down, sampling the water column directly below us. Its data streamed wirelessly to my laptop. The initial hours had been uneventful, a predictable symphony of the river. The low rumble of the current, the occasional distant splash of a jumping fish, the subtle creaks and groans of submerged timber shifting in the flow. I was half dozing, reviewing the spectral analysis, looking for the telltale acoustic signatures of king salmon. It was tedious work, the kind that makes you question why you spent 4 years in grad school. I remembered a particularly grueling field season in the Bering Sea. The constant motion of the research vessel, the smell of diesel and salt. This was comparatively peaceful. Then the pattern shifted. A low-frequency sound emerged, distinct from the ambient noise. It wasn't organic. It was a rhythmic, almost mechanical pulse. Thump, thump, thump. It was too regular, too deep to be natural river dynamics. My first thought was an engine, maybe a late-night fishing boat, but the frequency was wrong for a prop wash, and the rhythm was too precise. I checked the real-time spectrogram. The pulse registered as a tight, consistent band around 30 Hz, with clear harmonics. Huh, I mumbled, leaning closer to the screen. My initial, fatigued assessment was interference. A ground loop maybe, or a faulty transducer. I ran a quick diagnostic on the River 3000. All systems green. I checked the gain settings, the filter banks. Everything was within nominal parameters. The pulse persisted, unwavering. I toggled to the secondary data stream, the visual feed from our onshore camera. It was a low-light, infrared unit, panning slowly across the river. The surface was glassy, reflecting the pale sky. Empty. Not a single boat, not even a duck. Just the river, flowing silently under the perpetual twilight. The camera completed its sweep, paused, and began again. Nothing. Meanwhile, the pulse in my headphones continued. Thump, thump, thump. It was like a slow, deliberate heartbeat, felt rather than heard, vibrating through the hydrophone's sensor. The regularity was unnerving. I'd logged hundreds of thousands of hours of underwater sound, from the chirps of belugas to the tectonic groans of glacial ice. And I'd never encountered anything quite like this. It lacked the chaotic complexity of natural phenomena. Yet it wasn't the clean, engineered sound of human machinery. It was something else. I glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. My shift officially ended at 2 o'clock, but I wasn't about to wake Lena for this. This was an anomaly, and protocol dictated I document it thoroughly before calling it in. I started a dedicated recording session, time-stamping the event. As I watched the spectrogram, the pulse began to accelerate. Slowly at first, imperceptibly. Thump, 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 thump. The rhythm tightened, the pauses between each beat shortening. It wasn't a sudden jump, but a gradual, organic quickening, like a resting heart moving into exertion. The frequency remained stable, but the tempo increased, building a subtle but undeniable tension in the soundscape. I felt a cold prickle on my arms. The river camera still showed nothing but the empty surface, the distant, shadowed line of spruce trees. The acceleration continued, the individual pulses blurring into a rapid, insistent thrum. It was no longer a thump, but a deep, resonant vibration. The van itself seemed to hum with it. Or maybe that was just my imagination, a psychosomatic response to the relentless rhythm. "Lena," I said, my voice barely a whisper, though I knew she wouldn't hear me. "Wake up." I grabbed my field radio. "Base, this is Vance, Kenai Site Alpha. Do you copy?" Static. We were in a known dead zone for direct radio, relying on satellite uplink for data. That was another protocol I was breaking. Direct communication for anomalous events. But I needed confirmation. We had a second, identical River I-3000 deployed 0.6 miles upstream, near a smaller tributary confluence. It was meant to provide comparative data, to track fish movement between points. I switched the laptop's input to the upstream unit. The screen refreshed, displaying a new spectrogram. There it was, the same low-frequency pulse. Thump, 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 thump. But it was slightly out of phase with the primary unit's signal. The rhythm was identical, the acceleration matched, but the individual beats were offset by approximately 0.7 seconds. This wasn't a single point source. This was something vast, something generating a pulse that propagated through the water, reaching our two hydrophones at different times, yet maintaining its synchronized, accelerating rhythm. The sound in my headphones was now a frantic, hammering beat, a deep, resonant boom, 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 boom. It filled the small cabin, vibrating the floor under my feet. The onshore camera, still panning, caught a glint of light on the water. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a ripple, a disturbance that wasn't from the current. But it was gone before I could focus. The pulse intensified, becoming almost painful, a pressure in my chest. I knew professionally that I should retrieve the hydrophones. They were cheap, yes, but valuable data collection tools. But something held me. A morbid curiosity. A primal fear that rooted me to my seat. Listening to this impossible, accelerating heartbeat beneath the keen eye. The pulse reached a crescendo. A sustained, thunderous vibration that felt like the entire riverbed was resonating. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ceased. The soundscape returned to the gentle murmur of the current, the distant calls of nocturnal birds, the faint splash of a fish. Silence. A profound, echoing absence where the hammering had been. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at the blank spectrograms. The recording, I realized, had stopped. The data stream from both hydrophones had cut out. I tried to reconnect, but the software reported no device detected. Both units were gone. Their signals vanished, leaving only the memory of that impossible rhythm. We searched for them for 3 days, dragging grappling hooks and side-scan sonar, but found nothing. The data logs from the period leading up to the cutoff were corrupted, displaying only static after a certain point. It was as if the river had simply swallowed them whole, along with whatever had been beating beneath its surface. I'm Arthur Finch, a senior incident investigator for the Alaska Department of Transportation. For the past 17 years, my work has primarily involved assessing anomalies in our state's infrastructure, particularly where human error or environmental factors intersect with engineering. Tunnels, especially the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel, are a frequent subject. It's a unique structure, over 2.5 miles long, running through a mountain, connecting Portage with Whittier. It's the longest highway tunnel in North America, and it's famous for its single-lane operation, shared by both vehicles and trains, controlled by a complex timing system. The call came in late on a Tuesday, well past my usual cutoff. A routine maintenance log from the Anton Anderson crew had flagged something unusual. A misplaced high-8 cassette, found during a shift change. That phrase itself was odd. High-8 wasn't standard for our modern surveillance, but older equipment was still in use for some specialized internal recording, usually for specific maintenance tasks or inspections. My initial thought was simple data recovery. Maintenance crews often record visual inspections, especially of the tunnel's concrete lining, ventilation systems, or track conditions. The Anton Anderson, or Whittier Tunnel, as most call it, operates on a strict schedule. Vehicle traffic flows one way for 15 minutes, then reverses. Then, a train might pass. Then, the cycle repeats. There are specific tunnel hours for maintenance, usually in the dead of night, where one direction is completely shut down, or the tunnel is fully closed for larger operations. The core protocol for any tunnel closure, or single-lane operation, is absolute control. Entry and exit points are secured, and a precise log of all personnel and vehicles inside is maintained. Redundancy is built in. Physical barriers, light signals, radio communication, and often a lead and tail vehicle for any maintenance convoy. No unscheduled vehicle, absolutely no unscheduled anything, is permitted inside during a controlled state. This is non-negotiable for safety. The cassette, once retrieved from the maintenance office in Portage, looked like any other high-8 tape. It was unlabeled, a generic brand, slightly scuffed. I took it back to my office in Anchorage, to a dedicated playback unit we keep for legacy media. The first few minutes were static, then a shaky, handheld view of the tunnel's interior. It looked like a standard inspection, probably from the passenger seat of a utility truck. The date stamp on the bottom right corner of the frame read 02/14/2008, 02:17 a.m. That immediately raised a flag. February 14th, 2008 was a Thursday. According to our logs, the tunnel was under one-way control for westbound traffic only, meaning vehicles could only exit Whittier and proceed towards Portage. No eastbound traffic was permitted. More importantly, at 2:17 a.m., the tunnel was scheduled for a full closure for a track inspection. No vehicular traffic, maintenance or otherwise, was permitted. I fast-forwarded through long stretches of the tunnel's ribbed concrete walls, the occasional emergency exit, the dull glare of the sodium lamps. The audio was mostly road noise, the low rumble of the truck, the occasional crackle of a radio. Then, at the 2:24 mark, something shifted. The truck seemed to slow, and the camera, still handheld, panned slightly towards the windshield. And then I heard it. A horn. Not the short, sharp blast of a utility truck, but a deeper, resonant sound. A train horn. It echoed in the enclosed space, a long, mournful blast that seemed to hang in the air for a full 3 seconds. My stomach tightened. No trains were scheduled at that time. No trains. The track inspection was for a closed tunnel. I rewound and played it again, listening intently. The horn was unmistakable. It was followed by a faint, almost imperceptible metallic screech, like heavy brakes on steel. The truck on the video seemed to drift slightly, and the camera wobbled, as if the person holding it had flinched. I paused the video, staring at the timestamp. 2:24 a.m. I pulled up the DOT's master schedule for that specific date and time. Confirmed. Tunnel fully closed for track inspection. No rail traffic, no vehicular traffic. I called the crew chief from that night, a veteran named Miller. He was retired by then, living in Wasilla. He remembered the shift, remembered the track inspection. "Quiet night, Finch," he'd said, his voice raspy. "Just us and the tracks." I asked him about any unscheduled events, any unusual sounds. He paused. "No, nothing. Smooth as glass." I didn't mention the cassette yet. I wanted to see the rest of it first. I went back to the tape. The camera was still focused on the windshield, but now, a subtle change. There was condensation on the glass, just a faint haze in the cold tunnel air. And in that condensation, something was written. Not etched, but like a finger had traced letters. The light from the tunnel lamps caught it at an angle, making it hard to discern. I used our digital enhancement software, zooming in. My name is Arthur Finch, and for the past 17 years, I've worked as an industrial safety inspector, specializing in maritime facilities across the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. I've seen everything from collapsing dry docks to oil spills, faulty ventilation systems in processing plants, and the aftermath of countless human errors. My job is to identify risks, enforce protocols, and prevent disaster. Most of what I deal with is mundane. Rusted catwalks, uncalibrated pressure gauges, insufficient lockout-tagout procedures. But every so often you stumble onto something that just doesn't fit the regulations. This particular incident started with a thrift store find in Anchorage. I was browsing a dusty corner of a second-hand shop, looking for old nautical charts, when I spotted a box of VHS tapes marked Kodiak Cannery Records. Given my line of work, and a general interest in the history of these old facilities, I bought the box for $10. Most of the tapes were what you'd expect. Training videos on salmon gutting, quarterly safety meetings, inventory logs. But one tape, simply labeled Night Rig Test, 1998, caught my eye. I took it home, threaded it into my ancient Panasonic VCR, a piece of equipment I keep solely for these kinds of historical curiosities, and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, displaying the grainy, desaturated image of a cannery dock at night. It was clearly Kodiak. The distant silhouette of the mountains was unmistakable, even through the low-resolution recording. 3 night guards, bundled in heavy Carhartts, were visible, their breath pluming in the cold Alaskan air. They were, as the label suggested, testing a new halogen lighting rig. From what I could tell, it was a brand new setup, probably a retrofit to improve visibility and reduce energy consumption. The guards, whom I'll call Mark, Dave, and Jim based on their shouted names, were moving along the dock, checking the alignment and intensity of a series of powerful halogen floodlights mounted on tall poles. Mark, who seemed to be in charge, held a clipboard, occasionally making notes. Dave was operating a portable generator and a small control panel, while Jim was up on a scissor lift, adjusting the light fixtures. The hum of the generator was a constant, low thrum in the background, punctuated by the occasional clang of metal as Jim tightened a bracket. I remember thinking how crisp the air must have been, the kind that makes your lungs ache slightly, a sensation I've grown accustomed to over the years. Their procedure was fairly standard. Mark would call out a grid coordinate, Dave would activate the corresponding lights, and Jim would fine-tune the beam. "Grid B7, Dave." Mark's voice crackled through the tape's audio. "Let's see that spill." A bank of lights near the water's edge flared, momentarily overexposing the footage. Jim, from his perch, gave a thumbs up. "Looks good, Mark. Good throw." This went on for about 20 minutes, a methodical, almost boring display of industrial maintenance. My own experience told me this was likely an unscheduled, late-night test, probably to avoid disrupting daytime operations. It wasn't strictly against protocol to do it this way, but it certainly increased the risk factor, especially with only 3 men on site. I made a mental note, a professional habit, that proper supervision for such an installation would typically involve at least one certified electrician or project manager. Then, the first anomaly. A faint metallic clong, clong sound drifted in from the periphery of the audio. It was barely audible over the generator and the wind, but it was there. I rewound the tape, adjusted the tracking, and played it again. Definitely a sound. It sounded like a buoy bell, the kind that marks navigational hazards. But something about it felt off. I couldn't place it. Mark paused his note-taking. "You guys hear that?" Dave shrugged. "Wind, maybe? Or one of those old fishing boats rattling." Jim, still up in the lift, shook his head. "Doesn't sound like a boat. Sounds like a bell." The sound repeated. Clong, clong, clong. It had a distinct, slow rhythm, almost mournful. My mind immediately went to the local charts I knew so well. There wasn't a buoy with that specific bell tone stationed anywhere near that part of the Kodiak harbor. All the navigational aids were either lighted markers or foghorns. A bell buoy was an anachronism for that location, especially one that sounded so distant yet clear. I thought for a moment it might be a recording artifact, a stray radio signal picked up by the old camera's microphone, a common issue with consumer-grade equipment. It was a convenient dismissal, a professional's easy out. As the bell sound continued, the newly installed halogen lights began to flicker. Not a power surge flicker, but a rhythmic dimming and brightening. It wasn't all the lights at once, but individual banks, almost as if they were responding to something. Clong, clong, clong. And with each clong, a section of lights would dip, then surge back. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a faulty ballast, but the pattern was too consistent. "What the hell?" Dave muttered, staring at his control panel. "Voltage is stable, no load spikes." He tapped the panel, then checked the generator. "Everything's green." Mark walked over, his brow furrowed. "It's like they're dancing." Jim, now lowered from the lift, stood beside them, his eyes wide. "It's the bell, isn't it? The lights are doing what the bell's doing." I paused the tape, my finger hovering over the rewind button. This was no equipment malfunction. The precision of the flickering, synchronized with the phantom bell, was too deliberate. I scanned the background of the shot, looking for any environmental clues. That's when I saw it. Tacked to a support beam on the cannery wall, barely visible in the dim light, was a tide chart. I zoomed in as best as the VHS resolution allowed. The date was clearly visible. September 1998. And beneath it, the word neap was circled for that week. Neap tide. Minimal tidal range. The water would have been relatively still. No strong currents to dislodge a buoy. No unusual wave action to cause a bell to ring erratically. This only deepened the mystery of the bell. The tape resumed. The guards were no longer focused on their test. They were huddled together, looking out towards the dark water. The bell continued, now slightly louder, more insistent. Clong, clong, clong. The lights on the dock, a dozen powerful halogens, pulsed in unison with the sound, casting long, shifting shadows that danced like specters across the wet concrete. "It's out there," Jim whispered, pointing a trembling finger towards the black expanse of the harbor. "Something's out there." Mark, ever the pragmatist, grabbed a handheld spotlight. "Let's check the pier. Maybe something's adrift." "Mark, no!" Dave grabbed his arm. "That's not right. That bell, it's not from here." But Mark was already moving, shining the powerful beam across the water. The spotlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the choppy, inky surface. The halogen lights continued their synchronized dance, a silent, visual echo of the unseen bell. The generator's hum seemed to waver, and the audio on the tape became increasingly distorted, a low, guttural static starting to creep in. Suddenly, the bell changed its rhythm. It sped up, becoming a frantic, almost desperate clanging. Clong, 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 clong. The dock lights went haywire, flashing erratically, independently, like a strobe light gone mad. The audio became a cacophony of the frantic bell, the generator's strained whine, and the rising static. The camera, presumably mounted on a tripod, began to shake violently. "Get inside!" Mark yelled, his voice barely audible over the din. "Everybody, inside, now!" The last few frames of the tape showed the three guards scrambling, their figures distorted by the flashing lights, their faces etched with pure terror. One of them, I couldn't tell who, dropped something, perhaps the camera itself, and the image tilted wildly, showing only a blurred view of the frantic, pulsing lights against the dark water. The bell reached a crescendo, a deafening metallic shriek that seemed to tear through the old VCR's speakers. Then, silence. The screen went to static. The tape had ended. I sat there in the quiet of my living room, the faint whir of the VCR the only sound. I rewound the tape, watched it again, frame by frame, hoping I had missed something, a logical explanation. But there was nothing. No boat, no visible source for the bell, no electrical fault that could explain the synchronized lights. Just 3 men, a new lighting rig, a neap tide, and an inexplicable, terrifying symphony of light and sound from the dark waters of Kodiak. I've reviewed thousands of hours of footage in my career, looking for hazards, for failures, for the human element that leads to disaster. But this tape showed a procedural breakdown of a different kind. One where the protocols of the physical world seemed to have no bearing. The cannery was shuttered a year later, officially for economic reasons, but I can't help but wonder if the bell and whatever it heralded played a part. My name is Thomas Vance. For 23 years, I've worked as an independent commercial vehicle accident investigator, specializing in remote and extreme environments. Most of my career has been spent untangling the physics of what happens when 100,000 pounds of steel and cargo meet ice, or rock, or another 100,000 pounds of steel. I've seen it all, or so I thought. From brake failures on mountain passes to drivers falling asleep at the wheel on endless stretches of highway. But the case of the missing rig at Dalton Mile 297, near Adigan Pass, that one stuck with me. It was less about what happened and more about what didn't happen, and what couldn't possibly have happened. The call came in late October, just as the pass was starting to get truly treacherous. A Class 8 rig, hauling drilling equipment, had vanished. No distress signal, no GPS ping after a certain point. Just gone. The last known location was around Mile 297, deep into the Brooks Range foothills. Troopers found the truck 3 days later, nose down in a snowdrift a few yards off the road. It looked like the driver, a seasoned veteran named Miller, had pulled over, or maybe slid slightly, and just left the vehicle. Keys were in the ignition, engine cold, but otherwise intact. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away, just the tracks of the rig itself, stopping abruptly in the fresh powder. My job was to piece together the last moments of that truck. We deployed a team. The wind up there, even in a calm period, bites right through you. It carries the scent of pine and frozen earth, but mostly just the metallic tang of extreme cold. We established a perimeter, documented the scene with laser scanners and drone photography. Every inch of that truck was scrutinized. Fuel levels, tire pressure, brake lines, all checked out. The load was secure. It was a ghost ship, sitting there, waiting for a captain who wasn't coming back. The only piece of electronic data we had was the dash cam. Standard procedure: pull the SD card, download the footage, analyze it frame by frame. It's often the most telling witness in a single vehicle incident. Back at the field office in Fairbanks, a converted modular unit, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone from the equipment, I started reviewing the footage. The first 22 minutes were exactly what you'd expect for that stretch of the Dalton in late fall. A whiteout. Snow so thick the headlights barely cut through. Just a tunnel of swirling white. The truck was moving slowly, cautiously. Miller doing exactly what he was trained to do. You could hear the wipers struggling, the low rumble of the engine, the occasional hiss of air brakes as he modulated speed. Nothing unusual. My eyes were starting to glaze over, the familiar monotony of long-haul footage setting in. I remember thinking about a fishing trip I'd planned for next summer. The stark contrast of open water and warm sun to this frozen desolation. Then, at the 22:01 mark, it happened. The whiteout was still intense, but for a fraction of a second, maybe 10 frames, a hard black shadow crossed the headlight beams. It wasn't a deer or a moose or a car. It had no discernible form, no distinct edges, just a solid, light-absorbing void that blotted out the snow. My first thought was lens flare, or a smudge on the windshield. But the next frames showed the whiteout completely uninterrupted again. I rewound it, played it back at quarter speed, then frame by frame. The shadow was there, undeniable. It moved too fast to be anything natural, too opaque to be a trick of light. We ran thermal imaging on those frames. Nothing. No heat signature. Not even a trace of residual warmth that a living creature, or even a recently active engine, would leave against the sub-zero background. It was like a hole in reality had just passed in front of the truck. The dashcam also recorded audio from the cab, including the CB radio. We always review the CB chatter. Sometimes drivers call out road hazards, or even other drivers in trouble. Most of it was static, punctuated by snippets of conversation from other rigs further down the line. But then, about 30 seconds after the shadow incident, a distinct voice broke through the static. It was Miller's call sign, Icebreaker 7, repeated twice. Icebreaker 7, Icebreaker 7. The voice was strained, almost a whisper, but clear enough. That in itself wasn't odd. Drivers often check in. What was odd was when my audio tech, a sharp kid named Dave, ran the full audio through a spectral analysis to clean up background noise. He isolated that specific transmission, trying to enhance it. He called me over, a strange look on his face. "Boss, you gotta hear this." He played it back. The voice was the same, the words were the same, but it was reversed. The sound waves were literally inverted. It was like someone had recorded it, then played the tape backward, but the original recording was the reverse sound. There was no forward version of that transmission in the recording. It was a ghost in the machine. A message that defied the laws of audio physics. We tried everything to explain it. We simulated the dashcam footage in a controlled environment, trying to replicate the shadow with various objects, from dense fog to physical barriers. Nothing produced that same hard, non-reflective, non-thermal signature. We even considered a meteor, but the trajectory and speed didn't fit, and there was no impact crater. The CB audio was even more baffling. Dave, usually unflappable, spent days trying to find a logical explanation. Electromagnetic interference, a faulty chip, a software glitch. He found nothing. Every test confirmed the recording was accurate, and the sound wave was genuinely inverted. My protocol for unexplained phenomena usually involves rechecking all equipment, then expanding the search area. We rechecked the equipment multiple times. The search area was already vast, but we expanded it anyway, sending out snowmobiles and even a small fixed-wing aircraft for aerial reconnaissance. Nothing. No trace of Miller. No other tracks in the snow, just the rig and the impossible data. The troopers eventually closed the case as a probable disappearance under extreme conditions, citing the whiteout as a factor. But I couldn't. I kept going back to that dashcam footage, that impossible shadow, and Miller's voice, whispering. I'm Miles Corbin, 17 years with the Alaska State Troopers, specializing in missing persons and cold case recovery. Most of my work involves navigating the vast, unforgiving wilderness, often picking through the aftermath of bad decisions or worse luck. You learn to read the land, to understand how a body might drift in a river, or where a climber might fall. But some cases defy all logic, all experience. This was one of them. It started like many others. A call from a pair of spring hikers on the Matanuska Glacier. They'd found something unusual, a waterproof pelican-style case, frozen into a melt channel. Early April, the glacier was still mostly locked in winter, but the edges were starting to weep, carving intricate blue veins into the ice. We got the call late afternoon. The sun was already dipping, casting long purple shadows across the ice field by the time my team and I reached their position. A good 3-hour trek from the terminus. The hikers, a young couple from Anchorage, were huddled by the find, shivering despite their layers. They'd marked it with a small orange flag. The case itself was a bright yellow, about the size of a brick, and it was indeed encased in a block of ice, partially exposed in a shallow channel where meltwater was now trickling. The ice around it was remarkably clear, a deep, almost sapphire blue. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, the way the light caught the trapped air bubbles, creating tiny, shimmering galaxies within the frozen water. It was a fleeting, irrelevant thought, quickly pushed aside by the task at hand. We carefully documented the scene. GPS coordinates, photographs from multiple angles, environmental conditions. The air had that sharp, metallic tang you only get on a glacier. A smell I associate with hard work and cold fingers. Extraction was delicate. We used heated probes and a small, battery-powered ice saw, slowly freeing the case without damaging it. The melt channel was shallow, only a few inches deep, but the current was surprisingly strong, a constant, low gurgle beneath the surface. It took us over an hour. Once free, the case was immediately bagged, sealed, and marked for transport back to the forensics lab in Palmer. Chain of custody is paramount, especially with potential evidence from a possible fatality. Back at the lab, it took another hour to gently thaw the ice blocks surrounding the case in a controlled environment. Once the water drained, the bright yellow casing emerged, pristine, no visible damage. The latches were stiff, but they opened with a satisfying click. Inside, nestled in foam, was a mini DV camcorder, a model from the early 2000s, and a spare battery. Both were dry. The camcorder even powered on. The date stamp on the display read April 27th, 2004. An old case. We'd had a few missing persons reports around that time, but nothing that immediately jumped out as a match. Most disappearances on the Matanuska are resolved within days, either found or tragically confirmed lost to a crevasse or avalanche. This one had been sitting, frozen, for almost 2 decades. We transferred the tape to a playback deck. The video quality for its age was surprisingly good. It began with shaky first-person footage, clearly shot by a climber. A man's voice, calm, slightly breathless, narrating his movements. He was alone. His face, illuminated by the camcorder's small built-in light, appeared occasionally as he adjusted the camera. He was wearing standard mountaineering gear. An insulated jacket, harness, crampons. The landscape was unmistakable. The Matanuska Glacier, but further up, deeper into the icefall, where the terrain is more fractured and treacherous. He was traversing a series of snow bridges, narrow spans of snow packed across deep crevasses. His breath plumed in the cold air. The sound of his crampons crunching on the ice was crisp, accompanied by the low rumble of the glacier itself. He talked about the conditions, how the recent cold snap had made the snow bridges surprisingly firm, but also how the deeper ice was still active. I remember seeing a note in the hiker's report about a late April cold snap that year. I'd initially dismissed it as just a weather detail, but now it clicked. That cold snap must have been what froze the melt channel solid, preserving the case. A small, almost imperceptible mistake in my initial assessment, overlooking a potentially crucial piece of context. The footage continued for what felt like an eternity, just him moving, the beam of his headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. Then he reached a particularly wide crevasse, spanned by a long, arching snow bridge. He paused, filming the vast, dark chasm below. The light from his headlamp reflected off the blue walls, showing an incredible depth. He took a deep breath, muttered something about making good time, and started across. Midway across the snow bridge, the footage shifted. His headlamp beam, usually fixed forward, dipped slightly. He paused, his body tensing. The camera, still attached to his helmet, tilted down, then sharply to the left. That's when we saw it. Beneath the ice, in the deep, dark water of the crevasse, a light. Not a reflection of his own headlamp, but a distinct, separate glow. It was small, spherical, and a pale, phosphorescent blue. It moved. Slowly at first, then with an unnerving, deliberate speed. And it was moving upstream, against the current of the meltwater flowing beneath the ice, against all logic. The climber froze. His breathing hitched. He didn't speak. Just a soft, guttural sound, almost a whimper. The blue light continued its impossible journey, a silent, alien presence under the glacier. It was moving towards him, from the deeper, darker reaches of the crevasse. The climber tried to back away, his crampons scraping frantically on the snow bridge. He fumbled for something on his harness. The camera swung wildly. Then, the blue light passed directly beneath him. It was closer than it looked on screen, just a few feet below the snow bridge, clearly visible through the thin ice. It pulsed faintly, like a slow, deep heartbeat. The climber let out a strangled cry. He stumbled, falling to one knee. The camera captured a brief, terrifying glimpse of his face, wide-eyed, bathed in the eerie blue glow from below. Pure, unadulterated terror. The light continued, moving past him, still upstream, disappearing into the darkness of the crevasse mouth behind him. The climber scrambled up, his movements jerky, panicked. He turned, looking back into the darkness where the light had vanished. He raised his hand, pointing, but said nothing. The only sound was his ragged breathing and the distant creak of the glacier. Then, the footage cut out. Abruptly, the screen went black, replaced by the blue static of the playback deck. The tape was over. We reviewed it countless times. Slow motion, frame by frame. We enhanced the light. It was definitely a discrete source, not a reflection. It definitely moved against the observed current. We ran the climber's face through our databases. No match. The missing persons reports from 2004 yielded nothing. No one reported missing on the Matanuska with that specific profile, that equipment, or that date. It was as if he had simply appeared, filmed this impossible event, and vanished. The standard SAR protocols for a missing climber, grid searches, crevasse rappels, aerial surveys, all felt utterly useless. How do you search for someone who encountered something that defies physics? Something that moves under the ice, against the current. We had no body, no gear, no further trace beyond that single, horrifying tape. The cold snap that had preserved the case had also, perhaps, sealed his fate, freezing over the very melt channel where the light had been. The case was eventually classified as an unexplained disappearance, filed away with the dozens of others that haunt my desk. But the image of that blue light, moving with impossible intent beneath the ancient ice, still surfaces in my mind. A chilling reminder that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed. I'm Mark Jensen, an environmental compliance officer for the state's Department of Natural Resources. I've been in the field for 17 years, primarily focused on abandoned mining sites and protected wilderness zones in Alaska. My job involves ensuring that these former industrial areas don't pose ongoing environmental threats, and that their historical significance is preserved, often through remote monitoring. The Kennecott Mines National Historic Landmark is one such area. A vast, rugged expanse of glacial valleys and mountains, dotted with the skeletal remains of early 20th century copper extraction. It's a place of incredible beauty and extreme isolation, and it's my responsibility to keep it that way. Part of my routine involves deploying and checking a network of trail cameras. These aren't for wildlife observation, not primarily. They're for monitoring human activity, ensuring no unauthorized access or disturbance to the fragile historical structures and the environment. We place them strategically along old access roads, near unstable adits, and at approaches to the main mill complex. The cameras are robust, designed for Alaskan winters, and set to trigger on motion, capturing both still images and short video bursts, often with infrared capabilities for night vision. It was late September, the last good window before the snows really set in. I was back at the field office in McCarthy, downloading data from the SD cards I'd collected from the upper Kennecott Glacier area. The air outside was crisp, carrying the faint metallic tang of glacial meltwater that always reminded me of the raw, untamed nature of this place. I had a thermos of lukewarm coffee beside me, the kind that's mostly just hot water and a hint of bitterness, and I was cycling through hundreds of images, mostly Dall sheep, a few bears, the occasional distant hiker with a valid permit. Standard stuff. Then I came across the card from Camera Unit 7B, positioned on a ridge overlooking the old tramway path, a zone explicitly marked as restricted due to unstable ground and historical artifacts. My first pass showed nothing unusual, just the usual wildlife. But then I noticed a sequence captured just after midnight, 3 nights prior. A faint glow in the distance. My initial thought was a reflection, or perhaps a distant aircraft, though that was unlikely given the altitude and flight paths. I zoomed in. It was a headlamp. A single distinct point of light, moving. I frowned. No permits had been issued for nighttime access in that sector for months. I cross-referenced the permit database just in case. A last-minute research team had slipped through the cracks. Nothing. This was unauthorized. I marked the sequence for closer review and continued scrolling. The headlamp appeared again, closer this time. Then another, and another. 4 distinct lights, moving slowly, deliberately. My first mistake, I think now, was dismissing the initial pattern as a quirk of the camera's motion detection. The figures were moving in a rigid, almost geometric fashion. They would advance, stop, advance again. Each stop seemed to be at an identical interval, forming a precise, invisible grid across the uneven terrain. It was too regular for casual hiking, too regular for anything I'd ever seen. I switched the footage to infrared. That's when my blood ran cold. The figures, illuminated by their own headlamps, appeared as silhouettes against the warmer background of the rock and sparse vegetation. But their thermal signature was wrong. Deep, uniform blue-black. They were colder than the surrounding environment, significantly colder. Rock faces, even at night in September, would retain some residual heat, or at least match the ambient air temperature. These figures registered as if they were radiating cold, absorbing heat rather than reflecting it. It was like looking at a vacuum in human form. I leaned closer to the screen, my coffee forgotten. The standard protocol for unauthorized entry is clear. Document, report, and if possible, approach with caution to identify and inform. But what was I supposed to report? 4 humanoids radiating negative heat, moving in a grid pattern? This wasn't a lost hiker. This wasn't a poacher. This was something else. I tried to call Ranger Station Alpha, the nearest manned outpost, but the satellite phone signal was patchy, as it often is in the deeper valleys. Jensen here. Got something strange on 7B. Thermal anomaly. Grid movement. The call dropped before I could relay the full details. Just static. I tried again, and again. Nothing. The normal communication protocols had failed. I went back to the footage. The figures continued their methodical traverse. They seemed to be scanning the ground, or perhaps the air, with their headlamps, though the beams never seemed to stray from a narrow cone directly in front of them. The silence of the footage, broken only by the occasional click of the camera's internal mechanism, amplified the eerie precision of their movements. I remembered my daughter once asking me if ghosts lived in the old mines, after a particularly vivid storybook. I'd laughed it off, telling her ghosts weren't real, just stories people told about places that felt old and empty. Now, looking at these cold, methodical figures, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan autumn. The last sequence was the most disturbing. One of the figures, identifiable by its cold thermal signature and the precise arc of its headlamp, moved directly towards the camera. It didn't hesitate, didn't seem to find the camera. It approached with the same measured pace. The headlamp beam filled the frame, blinding the lens for a moment. Then, a single close-up frame. It was the camera's lens cap, snapped shut. The black plastic, the small tether. It was unmistakable. The image was perfectly centered, perfectly focused. It wasn't an accidental brush. It was a deliberate, final act. The memory card ended there. I sat back, staring at the blank screen. Whoever or whatever those things were, they knew the camera was there. They didn't avoid it. They acknowledged it, then disabled it. The cold, the grid, the precision, the deliberate act. It defied every explanation in my professional experience. My job is to understand and mitigate threats, to ensure compliance. But how do you comply with something that registers as colder than rock and moves like a geometric equation? I still don't have an answer. The camera was found a week later, still capped, still in place. Nothing else was disturbed. No footprints, no trace. Just the memory card, ending with that single, perfectly centered image of a snapped lens cap. My profession is forensic media analysis. For the past 15 years, I've specialized in digital evidence, primarily video and audio, for various law enforcement agencies, and, occasionally, private firms. My lab is a sterile, climate-controlled environment, a world of blinking LEDs, humming servers, and high-resolution monitors. We deal with everything from grainy convenience store robberies to complex deepfake investigations. Most of it is mundane, a methodical grind of data recovery, enhancement, and authentication. This particular package arrived in late November, right when the polar night was settling over Reykjavik. It wasn't a standard evidence submission. It came via registered mail, addressed simply to Station Manager, KBRW Radio, Reykjavik, then forwarded to us by the local police after the station manager, a woman named Agnes, felt uneasy about its contents. The outer packaging was a standard padded envelope, but inside was a sealed Ziploc bag, the kind you'd use for sandwiches. No return address, no note, just the Ziploc containing a single, older model smartphone, a generic Android from about 5 years ago, powered off. My initial assessment followed protocol. The Ziploc itself was sealed tight, the plastic faintly smelling of, well, just plastic. Maybe a hint of something metallic, like old batteries. We documented the chain of custody, photographed the package unopened, then opened it in a cleanroom environment. The phone was carefully removed, placed in a Faraday bag to prevent any remote wiping, and then transferred to our digital forensics workstation. My assistant, Mark, handled the initial data extraction, while I logged the physical characteristics. The phone was remarkably clean. No fingerprints on the surface, which was unusual. Even a casual user leaves some trace. "Looks like a factory reset, boss," Mark reported, his voice flat, as he connected it to our write blocker and data extraction tool. No user data, no apps, nothing. Just the stock OS. Check the internal storage, system partitions. Sometimes things get buried, I instructed, leaning closer to his monitor. I've seen people try to wipe phones clean before, but rarely this thoroughly. It felt less like an attempt to hide data, and more like a device prepared for a single, specific purpose. He worked for another hour, running deep scans. "Wait," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "Found something. A single video file. Buried in a system folder, not the usual DCIM directory. And the timestamp. It's recent. Just a few days ago. That was the anomaly. A completely clean phone, yet with one deliberately hidden recent video file. We extracted it, verified its integrity, and then I loaded it onto my primary analysis station. The screen glowed, illuminating the slight dust motes dancing in the cool air of my office. The footage began abruptly. It was handheld, shaky, clearly shot on a phone, in what appeared to be near total darkness. The only light source was a single window in the distance, maybe 200 yards away, cutting through the blackness of what I immediately recognized as polar night. The camera's internal clock indicated it was around 3 a.m. The wind was audible, a low, constant moan, occasionally punctuated by sharper gusts. I could tell from the audio alone that it was significant, probably exceeding 30 knots. I've spent enough time reviewing weather data for accident reconstructions to recognize the sound of serious wind. The window was in a small, isolated house, a standard Utqiagvik dwelling, probably a single-story, boxy structure designed to withstand the brutal Arctic conditions. It wasn't just lit, it was glowing, a warm, almost orange light, intense and unwavering against the absolute blackness. There was no other light source visible, no streetlights, no other houses, just that single, defiant rectangle of light. I watched, making mental notes. The camera held steady for almost 2 minutes. The wind noise constant. The window glowing. Then, subtly, the light began to dim. It wasn't an abrupt flick of a switch. It was a gradual fading, as if someone inside was walking away from the window, carrying a lantern or a flashlight, moving deeper into the house. The glow receded, becoming fainter. Then just a dull ember, and finally, after about 30 seconds, it extinguished completely, plunging the scene back into an oppressive, absolute darkness. The camera remained focused on the now dark house for another minute, the wind still howling. Then, the footage shifted. The camera operator slowly panned away from the house, moving deliberately, not quickly, as if surveying the surroundings. It was still dark, but I could see the faintest hint of a horizon line, suggesting the approach of civil twilight, the first faint hint of dawn, which would be hours away during polar night. The pan continued, showing the flat, snow-covered landscape. Then the sun rose. Not a full sunrise, but the first sliver of the sun appearing above the distant horizon, casting long, stark shadows. The camera operator, with remarkable patience, continued the pan, slowly bringing the house back into view. The snow around the dwelling was pristine, undisturbed. And this is where the procedural breakdown began to really hit me. I immediately cross-referenced the timestamp with historical weather data for Utqiagvik. The wind speed at that exact time, according to the nearest weather station, was indeed averaging 35 knots, with gusts up to 45. At that speed, any fresh snowfall would be scoured, and any human footprints would be obliterated within minutes, if not seconds. But this was different. The snow was untouched. Not scoured, just smooth. Like a freshly laid white carpet. I zoomed in, enhancing the footage, running various filters. No tracks leading to or from the house. No snowdrifts that would indicate recent activity. It was as if no one had approached or left them. My name is Arthur Finch, and for the past 22 years, I've worked as a marine accident investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, specializing in small craft incidents in Alaskan waters. Most of my cases involve commercial fishing vessels, recreational boats, or, increasingly, kayaks and paddleboards. It's a job that demands a cold, hard look at facts, currents, weather, vessel integrity, human error. I've seen enough mangled hulls and tragic circumstances to understand that the ocean is unforgiving. But it usually plays by rules we can understand. This particular case, however, started to bend those rules. It began on a Tuesday in late May, when a pair of kayakers exploring Blackstone Bay, deep within Prince William Sound, found a GoPro Hero 7 Black, wedged in a crevice of a granite outcropping. It was a common enough discovery. Cameras get lost, especially in rough water. They brought it to the local Coast Guard station, who, seeing the potential for a missing person, forwarded it to my office in Anchorage. The camera was encased in its waterproof housing, which had done its job admirably. The SD card was intact. My first step, as always, was data acquisition. I ran it through our forensic imaging station, creating a bit-for-bit copy to preserve the original evidence. The card contained several video files, mostly scenic shots of glaciers and wildlife, typical tourist fare. The last file was dated October 14th of the previous year, time-stamped 14/37/12. It was a clear, crisp autumn afternoon, exactly the kind of day that draws people out onto the water before winter sets in. The footage showed a single-person touring kayak, a bright yellow plastic model, cutting through calm, almost glassy water. The camera was mounted on the bow, facing forward. The paddler, unseen, was making good progress. The water was flat, reflecting the deep blue sky and the distant, snow-capped peaks of the Chugach Mountains. No wind chop, no discernible current. Ideal conditions. My initial thought was that this was a straightforward recovery operation. Find the owner, check for a missing persons report, close the file. I started logging the environmental conditions from the footage. Sky, clear, high sun angle. Sea state, 0 to 1, negligible. Wind, estimated 0 to 5 knots, light air. I cross-referenced this with historical weather data for the area on that specific date and time. It matched perfectly. The NOAA buoy data from Port Valdez showed calm winds and no significant wave action. The tide tables indicated a slack high tide, meaning minimal currents. Everything aligned. Then, at 14:38:05, the first anomaly appeared. The horizon, which had been perfectly level, began to tilt. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then more distinctly. It was a rotation, not a pitch or roll. The entire panorama of mountains and sky seemed to list to port. My immediate thought was a camera malfunction, or perhaps the kayaker had bumped the mount. But as I watched, the kayak itself, visible in the lower frame, remained stubbornly level. The angle of the paddle, as it dipped into the water, was consistent with a paddler maintaining an upright position. The water surface itself, reflecting the sky, also remained flat relative to the kayak. It was as if the world around the kayak was tilting, not the kayak itself. I paused the video, zoomed in. The bubble level on my monitor, a digital overlay, confirmed it. The horizon line was now approximately 7 degrees off true horizontal. But the kayak's waterline, relative to the camera frame, was still perfectly even. I rewound, played it again. Same thing. I called in my colleague, Sarah Chen, our lead video analyst. "Sarah, take a look at this," I said, pointing to the screen. "Am I losing my mind? Or is that horizon doing something impossible?"
She leaned in, her brow furrowed. Definitely tilting. But the boat, the boat's not moving. You'd expect the whole frame to tilt if the camera mount shifted, or if the kayak rolled. She ran her own set of stabilization algorithms, trying to lock onto the kayak's waterline. The results were consistent. The kayak remained stable while the background rotated. We continued watching. The tilt slowly increased, reaching about 10 degrees over the next minute. The kayaker continued paddling, seemingly oblivious, or perhaps just focused on their stroke. There was no sudden movement, no splash, no sign of distress. The calm, almost meditative rhythm of the paddle continued. The only sound was the gentle slosh of water against the hull and the occasional dip of the paddle. Then, At 14:39:21, it happened. A deep, resonant blast cut through the quiet. A foghorn.
I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the lab. A foghorn? I muttered. But it's clear. Look at the footage. Not a cloud in the sky. Sarah immediately pulled up the AIS, Automatic Identification System, logs for Prince William Sound for that date and time. AIS transponders broadcast vessel identity, position, course, and speed. It's a robust system for tracking maritime traffic. She filtered for a 5 nautical mile radius around the camera's GPS coordinates, which we'd extracted from an earlier file. Nothing, she announced after a moment. No vessels within 5 nautical miles. The closest commercial traffic was a state ferry, 12 miles out, heading towards Whittier. And no fog in the forecast or observations for that area. This was a direct contradiction. A foghorn, by definition, implies reduced visibility. But the footage showed perfect clarity. And if there was a vessel, it should have been on AIS, unless it was a pleasure craft without AIS. But even then, a foghorn in clear weather is highly unusual, bordering on a distress signal. I remembered a trip I took with my father when I was a boy, fishing for halibut out of Seward. The fog rolled in so thick you couldn't see the bow, and his old diesel horn blared every 2 minutes. A deep, mournful sound that echoed off the unseen cliffs. This sound on the video was identical, but the visual context was entirely wrong. We watched the footage again. The horizon continued its slow, impossible tilt. It was now approaching 15 degrees. The foghorn sounded again, closer this time. A long, drawn-out blast. The kayakers paddling faltered for a fraction of a second. A slight hesitation in their stroke, before resuming. A subtle acknowledgement, but no panic. No looking around. Just the steady, rhythmic pull. The light began to shift. It wasn't fading. It was as if the sun itself was being stretched. The clear blue sky taking on a strange, almost bruised quality along the tilted horizon. The water, still flat relative to the kayak, started to reflect this distorted light. The hum of the server racks in the lab felt like a low thrumming in my own chest, an echo of the unnatural quiet on the screen. The foghorn blasted a third time, much louder, the sound seeming to emanate from directly ahead, yet nothing was visible. The horizon was now past 20 degrees. The visual distortion was becoming more pronounced. The distant mountains, once sharp, were starting to waver, their peaks appearing to shimmer. The kayak impossibly remained level. Then the footage abruptly ended. The screen went black. The timestamp froze at 14:40:01. We tried to recover more data, running deeper forensic scans on the SD card. Nothing. The file was complete. No corruption, no missing frames. It just stopped. We checked every database. No missing persons report for a kayaker in Prince William Sound around October 14th. No recovered kayak wreckage. No distress calls. Just that camera, found months later, miles from where the footage was recorded, yet within the same general area. The official report remains open, filed under unexplained disappearance. My professional protocol demands that all evidence must be reconciled. But here, the primary evidence, the camera footage, directly contradicts all other verifiable data. A flat sea where the horizon tilts. A foghorn in clear air with no vessels present. It's an impossible scenario, yet I watched it happen. I've replayed that footage dozens of times, looking for a trick of light, a camera error, anything. But the data is consistent. The kayak was level, the world was tilting, and whatever caused that foghorn to sound, it wasn't on our charts. Sometimes, the ocean doesn't just play by its own rules. It plays by rules we haven't even conceived of. And that, more than any wreckage or tragedy, is what truly haunts me. My name is Alex Thorne. I've been a digital forensics investigator for 17 years, specializing in remote and extreme environment data recovery. Most of my work involves aviation incidents, maritime accidents, or, as in this case, search and rescue operations in Alaska's interior. We deal with damaged electronics, corrupted drives, and the often grim task of reconstructing the last moments captured by a device. This particular file, designated Bethel Tundra Line, Case 71-08-2023, came to us late last spring, after breakup had finally allowed for a full ground search. The snow machine, a Polaris Indy, had been found partially submerged in a meltwater channel, its front end caked in river silt. The handlebar-mounted action camera was still attached, though its casing was cracked and its internal battery swollen. Our first step, as always, was stabilization. The unit was carefully dried in a desiccant chamber for 72 hours, then disassembled in a clean room. I used a micro-soldering station to bypass the damaged power management circuit, connecting directly to the NAND flash memory chips. The data extraction process took another 2 days, working through a corrupted file system. The air in the lab always smells faintly of ozone from the ionizers and the specific metallic tang of an old solder flux, a scent I've grown accustomed to over the years. What we recovered was a single, continuous video file, approximately 3 hours in length. It was recorded at 1080p, 30 frames per second, with an embedded GPS track. The initial review was standard. The footage began with the rider, a young man named Jacob, leaving a small cabin near the Kuskokwim River, heading east across the flat, featureless tundra. The date stamp indicated early March. The sky was a uniform gray, the light flat, and the snow cover unbroken save for the occasional drift or frozen hummock. The engine hummed steadily, a low thrum that vibrated through the camera mount, occasionally punctuated by the crunch of the skis on packed snow. I remember, briefly, thinking about my own first time on a snowmobile as a kid. The sheer thrill of speed across an open field, a stark contrast to the grim purpose of this footage. For the first 2 hours, the footage was unremarkable. Jacob was a competent rider, maintaining a consistent speed. His helmet was visible at the bottom of the frame, occasionally shifting as he scanned the horizon. The GPS overlay showed a steady progression, a meandering line typical of cross-country travel, avoiding deeper snow pockets or hidden obstacles. Our protocol dictates a full, uninterrupted review, cross-referencing every 10 minutes with the GPS data, looking for any anomalies in speed, direction, or altitude. Around the 2-hour, 15-minute mark, something changed. The snow machine crested a slight rise, and in the distance, a series of dark vertical lines became visible against the white expanse. Stakes. Not survey flags, which are typically brightly colored, but simple, wooden stakes, perhaps 3 feet tall, driven into the snow. They formed a perfectly straight line, extending as far as the camera could see, directly across Jacob's path. My initial thought was that it was a new seismic survey line, or perhaps a boundary marker for a remote claim. I made a mental note to check local land records later, a routine part of contextualizing recovered data. Jacob slowed, then turned his machine to follow the line of stakes. He didn't hesitate, didn't stop to examine them. It was as if he recognized them, or perhaps simply felt compelled to follow. The line led him due north, away from any known trails or established routes. The landscape remained utterly featureless, an endless plain of snow and sky. The engine noise was constant, but the wind, which had been a low, persistent howl, seemed to diminish. The soundscape became strangely muted. At 2 hours, 43 minutes, 17 seconds, the GPS overlay froze. The latitude and longitude coordinates locked, displaying a single, unchanging point on the map. Yet, the video continued. The timestamp in the corner of the frame ticked forward, frame by frame. Jacob was still moving, the snow machine still humming, the stakes still passing by. I initially flagged this as a data corruption error, a common issue with damaged units where the GPS module might fail before the camera. I made a note to re-examine the raw GPS stream for packet loss. But, as the footage played on, the discrepancy became impossible to ignore. The snow machine was visually traversing the landscape. The stakes were clearly receding behind it. But the GPS coordinates remained static, anchored to that single point on the tundra. It wasn't corruption. It was a fundamental contradiction. Jacob continued to follow the stakes for another 12 minutes. The air, which had been still for some time, now felt unnaturally so. The snow machine's exhaust plumed vertically, dissipating slowly. There was no wind ripple on the snow surface, no movement in the sparse, frozen willows that occasionally dotted the landscape. It was utterly silent, save for the engine. Then, the stakes ended. Abruptly. One moment they were there, receding into the distance. The next, the last stake passed and there was nothing but open, unbroken tundra. Jacob slowed the snow machine to a near stop. The camera panned slightly as he looked around, a subtle shift in the handlebar. Directly ahead, perhaps 50 yards, was a shallow, circular depression in the snow. It wasn't deep, perhaps only a few feet, but its presence was an anomaly in the otherwise flat expanse. Jacob drove towards it. As he approached, the camera angle dipped, showing the ground directly in front of the machine. The snow in the depression was gone. Instead, there was a patch of dry, brittle grass, the color of straw, swaying gently. Swaying. In the utterly still air. I rewound, played it again, zoomed in. The blades of grass moved, individually, subtly, as if stirred by an imperceptible current. There was no visible source of air movement. No wind, no exhaust from the snow machine, which was now idling, its engine a low, throaty rumble. Jacob killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, almost deafening after 2 hours and 58 minutes of mechanical hum. The only sound was the faint, dry rustle of the grass. The camera, still mounted on the handlebar, was perfectly still. For a full minute, nothing happened. The grass continued its impossible, silent dance. Then, a shadow, Jacob's shadow, fell over the grass as he dismounted. The camera shifted slightly again, a jarring movement, then settled. The view was now fixed on the swaying grass, the shallow depression, and the vast, empty tundra beyond. The footage continued for another 4 minutes. The grass swayed. The sky remained a uniform gray. No sound. No movement from Jacob. Then, at 3 hours, 2 minutes, and 11 seconds, the screen went black. Not a gradual fade, not a battery depletion, but an instantaneous cut to black. as if someone had simply pressed stop, or the camera had been abruptly covered. Our search teams returned to the GPS coordinates where the overlay froze. They found nothing. No snow machine tracks. No sign of Jacob. No stakes. No depression. No dry grass. Just an unbroken expanse of snow, identical to the rest of the tundra. The coordinates where the snow machine was visually located when the camera went black, based on the last known trajectory before the GPS freeze, were hundreds of miles away, in an area that had already been searched extensively. The snow machine itself was found weeks later, miles from any of these points, partially submerged in a meltwater channel, as if it had simply appeared there during breakup. We have the footage. We have the frozen GPS data. We have the timestamp that continued to run. We have the missing person. And we have a set of coordinates on a map where, according to the camera, Jacob was, but according to every physical search, he wasn't. The Bethel Tundra line remains an open case. The data is all there, meticulously recovered. But it tells a story that simply cannot be reconciled with reality.